All right, I started recording. Yeah. So I'll just do again, quick introduction to myself again. Hi, I'm Jomi Epoyun. Uh, I've been coaching, spectating, or I've just been generally involved in speech and debate for at least a decade now. Been mainly involved in Congress for half a decade as well. In terms of like the stats, if those are even important to you, like I've coached people, T14 at Nationals, then T2 to T6 in like every possible conceptual tournament you could think of, besides like UK season opener, because none of the people I ever coach want to go there. I mainly private coach, but I've also coached schools. I've coached Stuyvesant for a couple years before. I've coached King High School in Tampa. I've coached a bunch of other places. But the biggest thing with me is that I'm just your average everyday dude. I'm not someone you should like idolize or like glorify. Like that's I think what makes me at least a decent coach is like I'm very interactive with the people that I work with, and I always make sure to like engage and take their ideas very seriously, because all of us have ideas that I think are important, but also I think could serve to like bring clarity to rounds and bring clarity to our to how we go about things in everyday life. So I value the ideas of everybody in this room, and I think it's very important. Um, in terms of like what we'll be talking about today, I think the biggest thing we'll be talking about is the idea of how do we make sure like we stand out and around. I think that's always something that we're always questioning and always asking ourselves is like, how do I make sure like my points are relatively important? And how do I make sure my points or arguments, ideas, main objectives that I'm coming into the round with are going to be heard, noticed, and the judges will value in a positive way. And I think something that is important to be able to get that off is the idea of making sure you're putting yourself in the right positions to do that. And so then that's what comes to the idea of like what we're going to be talking about today, which is like round vision. Now, I know that sounds like a very like sort of ambiguous term. So I want to ask people some questions in terms of what do they think, especially with what their coaches have talked about throughout the duration of the camp so far, what they possibly think of what round vision is. So if someone would like to just like start us off, just telling me, I want to get like each and everybody's opinion on what round vision is. So yeah, if you want to use the raised hand function, that'll be great. If not, you can just turn on your mic and then just talk. We'll start with Vincent though.
From my understanding, it's first identifying like one, the stock arguments, and secondly, what important arguments you should go for, especially if you're like giving a mid-round speech. There's a lot of arguments. Some don't matter that much. Some should matter. And that's what you're going to implicate yourself into the round.
Nice. Ranger.
For me, I think round vision is kind of understanding when I should speak and what I should speak about. So like for me, if I see that some arguments are really being attacked, I might add a lot of defense in my speech to the argument.
Awesome. Who's next? Inan, talk to me.
I feel like round vision is like the best way to like figure out what you want to specifically argue. Because like, for example, right, if you have like three people on like some side basically arguing the same thing that uses like the same link, the same warrant, well, that's probably the most relevant argument in a round then. And you have to use your round vision to understand that's what you want to refute the most. That's what you want to attack the main negation or affirmation advocacy, things like that. It's your way of figuring out what's the most relevant in round and then attacking it.
Awesome. Catherine.
I think it's mostly what everybody said, but my coach said that it's like more of like building a castle and your opponents on each side. And basically, for the first part of the debate, you probably want to build your castle, but during the middle and like the end, you want to reinforce your castle or try to attack the other castle. So basically, I think that's like the part where you're like, when you like strategically want to speak or like talk about whatever that blows a hole in the other tower.
Fantastic. Ty.
I feel like round vision is like basically adapting to what's happening in the round and adding it based on your speech and focusing your tone based on how people are attacking or are attacking versus your speech and what your point.
Excellent. Anybody else? Going once, going twice, sold. All right, cool. We'll continue. Everything that everybody has said so far is fantastic. That's pretty much in a nutshell what round vision is. The thing, like the ideas of adaptation, putting yourself in the right positions, understanding what the stock is, and understanding how the stock interacts with other ideas in the flow of the debate. So that is like the main thing we will talk about today, especially because the idea of round vision, at least in my eyes, and what you guys have so well articulated, is the idea of knowing what to do, how to do it, and how to play your role. And that starts with understanding what the stock is, but also what is the stock and beyond that. And what is required for that is having a perception of possible ideas. So that's why the title for today's lecture is Round Vision, Turning Perception into the Points on the Pad. Now, in order to be able to understand that, you need to be able to understand what is the flow of the round in terms of the round itself. And for me, in terms of always looking at a round in totality is looking at it in the forms of a timeline and how this one timeline can diverge into a plurality or multi-phase set of timelines throughout the course of the debate. And it's very similar to how, like, if you guys ever watch like Marvel movies, and we always talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? The idea of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the idea that there are, especially in the phase of it now, is that there is one timeline and then diverging different timelines in which we now have to consider, because if we affect one timeline, it may affect all the other timelines in the course of the cinematic or the universe or the multiverse, however you want to take it. I think the same sort of idea applies to a debate. We start with one timeline, and that timeline is the proposition of the sponsor. The ideas that are proposed in the sponsorship are therefore the first timeline that we must consider, or the first arguments that we must consider, because those are the arguments that set the stage for what we need to then talk about. Then, as we move forward into the timeline, as we move forward into the journey or the timeline of the round, these developmental ideas that start being formed, these constructive ideas, these ideas where we start hearing the new sort of things that we should consider, these then start branching off the existing timeline we have. So the original ideas that the first affirmation speech proposed should then branch off into multiple different varying timelines that propose varying different consequences. And that's what generally the constructive phase is. Then you start getting into your mid-round speeches. And your mid-round speeches start also considering new ideas, but then they're also starting to consider what are the pros and cons of the timelines that we see in our multiversal timeline round, per se. Like, oh, if we have like 5 different main ideas that have been proposed in the round so far, what are the pros and cons of these ideas? And how should we take these ideas and why should we consider them? And maybe your idea can also interact with some of these existing timelines or these existing ideas that were already proposed in the current flow of time. And then we start getting into the late round speeches. And I know possibly one of you may have already a question. What is the difference between a late round and a crystal? Well, I explained on the slide, but then also we'll get into that in a little bit more as we go on. But let me explain first what a late round is, or at least in the flow of time. In terms of the timelines now, we have now the main timelines that we see. We've considered the pros and the cons. The pros and the cons of each timeline have relatively been established by mid-round speakers and also early round speakers in their constructives. And now we've reached a point where now we must weigh the consequences of engaging in one of these timelines or valuing one of these arguments that have already previously been stated. At this point, presenting new versions, new ideas, new timelines to consider is something that is relatively frowned upon, because now you start getting in the way of, we don't have much time left to consider any new opportunities. So now we must soon make a decision on, hey, what do we do here? These are our main options. Why are these options important? And why should we choose one? And then we get into a crystallization speech, which is generally the last 2 to 4 speeches of the round, where now it is time to make a decision. We have gotten the ideas, we have gotten our timelines. We have now considered the pros and cons of our timelines. We have now weighed up the pros and cons of our timelines and why they are important. And now we need to consider why we should choose one timeline over the other overall. Are there any questions so far? Or just general statements? Nope. Sounds like everybody's good. If you want to just talk, you can just turn off your mic, turn on your mic and then just talk. But if not, we can keep going.
Yeah, question. So when it comes to maybe late round speeches, what is like, how could you avoid rehash? Because that's definitely like a huge thing. Besides just doing half refs, how can you completely avoid that and then still stick out while making valid points to your side, aside from refutation?
Awesome, great question. And we'll talk more about it later in the lecture, but I'll say the initial thing that you should always consider is what kind of argument you're giving and would it be relatively applicable to an early, a middle, or a late round, right? And so if this idea, if the main idea that you want to talk about is something that could possibly be said earlier, then obviously there's a high probability that it's probably going to be rehashed, and therefore you should probably not run the argument later on in the round, because either the timeline already exists because someone probably already said it, or the timeline cannot be considered at this stage in the game. And so even if it's not rehashed, it's something that doesn't really matter in the stage of the debate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And again, we'll get more into that, because the great thing about perceiving certain stuff in the round, or perceiving stuff in the round before you even get to the round, is that you then avoid a lot of these things in terms of rehash and feeling like you get stale in the debate. So vision requires anticipation. So that's why I'm saying this will not be a lecture on how to make the best arguments. That is not what this lecture is about. Because this lecture is more about how to spot the best kind of arguments and to when to give such arguments within the round for maximum effect. We all have a role to play in the debate. Being able to understand what argument plays what role then allows you to be able to execute your role best within the round, or where you would like to at least execute your role. If you feel your role is to be able to give the best early round, mid round, or late round speech, you then need to understand the kinds of arguments necessary to be able to then execute that role in the best way possible. Now, you're probably wondering again, why, Jomi? Why aren't you not teaching us how to make the best arguments? Well, one, I trust your coaches in this camp to be able to do that for me. I wouldn't want to be redundant and waste all of your time. But the biggest thing is I trust all of you. I trust all of you to be able to make solid arguments. You guys have incredible potential to do that already. And I'm sure all of you have shown ballots in which your arguments have been appreciated by judges. But I think the key thing is that if you're able to make the argument, that's not really an issue. The question is how do I identify that my argument is valuable in the round? So identification of knowing when to give the argument, I think, is a lot more fruitful of a question of an idea to entertain, rather than just figuring out how to make the best arguments. It's one thing to make the argument, it's another thing to know when to give it, and to be able to then your judge say, the round needed this at this stage of the game. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Sounds like we're good. All right, let's continue. Now to stalking and beyond. For me, in terms of understanding this, you then need to understand the 3 tiers of arguments in terms of round placement and round ideas, especially in the scope of the round. You have the primary arguments, your secondary, your tertiary arguments. And so I would say the primary arguments are what everybody would consider is the stock. Now, everybody's wondering, the stock. What is the stock? Well, the stock by dictionary definition are general, normative, field-dependent, and accompanied by decision rules. What does any of that mean? That means they're generally arguments that a lot of people would already know, especially when you start doing your research. If you start doing your research and 5 minutes into it, you already have 2 arguments, you're like, oh, that'll be great, that'll be great, that'll be great. That means they're probably stock already, because everybody's of relative similar intelligence, especially when we start getting into these high level rounds, these high pressure rounds, these high stakes rounds, where everybody is good speakers, everybody has made great arguments in rounds previous. That means everybody is probably starting off on a similar foot, meaning everybody probably kind of understands, all right, we kind of know that this debate is going to devolve into this, this, and this. So whoever gets these arguments first, these are going to be the stock issues. Now, in terms of the primary arguments, that means that they require the least amount of interaction with the rest of the round by the speaker, but is the most position dependent in the round. What does that mean? That means that they require to not have to engage with many of the other ideas in the round by other speakers. That means I don't have to do that much work in terms of understanding the flow or the timeline, because I'm the one that's generating a new timeline or generating an extension of the existing timeline as is. But that requires me to be early in the engagement of the timeline. In a sense, it basically means that I have to be the one to get in on the action first. That's why whenever companies are coming up with new ideas or new innovations, it's always about being the first to get there. Because if you're the first, that means you have to do the least amount of work in terms of generating growth in the long term. Everybody has to interact with you. You don't have to interact with anybody else. Everybody has to bite off your slice of the pie. You don't have to try to take anybody else's. Any questions so far? No? Awesome. So now we get into tier 2, which is your secondary arguments. These are the arguments that, even though in the primary arguments your mom will definitely know, in the secondary terms of arguments, these are the kind of arguments that your mom could know. She's like, oh, I heard about that. That sounds interesting. Maybe a coworker of mine talked about this before. These are the arguments that would interact with the stock issues, yet requires still some general knowledge and breakdown of the stock issues that then extend from the initial point at which the stock sits. Meaning that it is something that comes as a consequence of the stock or comes as a consequence of the primary arguments, but it's still relatively new in terms of the eye of the judge or the round. So stuff that starts branching off from the initial stock proposals. This is where we get into more of the divergence of more timelines. And therefore, this is where we have to start considering, why did this timeline diverge from this timeline? Or why did this argument diverge from this argument? This is where some more interaction is required, while still giving some general prospective idea of what the stock was initially talking about. And then finally, you have your tertiary arguments. These are the arguments where your mom will tell you after the round, hey, I didn't know that. That was interesting. I never really considered that. And these are arguments that interact the least with the principal stock arguments. So it interacts the least with the primary arguments, but requires the most interaction from the speaker's point of view, especially with interacting with tier 2 arguments or other tier 3 arguments, especially because of the idea that now we need to start weighing up our ideas. We need to start weighing up, like, what are the consequences of some of the tier 1 and tier 2 arguments, or especially the tier 2 and other possible tier 3 arguments. Any questions? Any concerns? Any just general thoughts? Nope. Awesome. Now, for an explanation of like the primary arguments, I like to consider them in terms of like stocks. So if you're ever on the stock market, a stock market company like comparison will be like the name brands of name brands, your Cokes, your General Electrics, PepsiCo, things like that, things that are wholesale brand names that everybody and their mom knows about. We see them on our everyday shelves and everyday walls. These are the cream of the crop type of arguments in terms of best ability to impact directly to people. Remember, we always want to be big on impacts, big on telling people why they should care. This is why the positioning in which you give these types of arguments must be relatively early in the round, because they are the arguments everyone wants to give, and therefore there's not enough to go around. That's how you avoid rehash, because once you then, before the tournament, you're sitting down, you're doing your research. Once you get to the point in which you're struggling a little bit to then generate immediate offense, you're starting to struggle a little bit with generating immediate, boom, you can impact to this, boom, you can impact to this, boom, you can impact to this. This is where you've run out of the primary arguments, that stock issues, the stock elements. This is where you've run out. And then once you run out of that, this is where you start saying, so these are the stock issues. How do I then start diverging from these? Yep. And in terms of specifications of how these primary arguments should go, I think it's relatively about 20% framing, which is basically telling me like what is the status quo of the problem so far, but also the status quo of everything in the round. 30% providing me the solvency, providing me how the bill solves or how the bill makes it worse, and 50% impacting, meaning 50% telling me why I should care, why is it important to the judge, why is it important to me, why is it important to Americans, why is it important to the American electorate, the American constituency, the American people, blah, 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 blah. Now we get back into tier 2, secondary, in terms of stock market comparison, is where we start getting into our Teslas, AMDs, NVIDIA, United Healthcare. Again, brand names, stuff that, people in these sectors would know about, but also things that the public would know about, but are not as big institutional brand names like Coke or Pepsi or General Electric or Chase or Wells Fargo. Those brands have been institutional, things that everybody knows. These are stuff that people will know, but it's still emerging, still developing. Things that we'll have to at least do a little bit of research, or have at least a little bit general knowledge before we can then consider these companies. So in terms of then argumentation, they're just as good as primary or tertiary arguments, but require a certain level of interaction within the chamber to satisfy the positioning requirement in the round. And that's why then the positioning of these arguments is critical for providing substantial reasoning for why the timelines or primary arguments are good or bad. That's why then it's critical to position yourself, not necessarily too early, because if you position yourself too early with a secondary argument, you then don't have the requisite interaction to be able to generate enough branching off of the timeline or branching off of a different idea to then warrant some of the analysis you want to get from a secondary argument to be able to then stand out. But if you do it too late, then you come into the issue of providing too much of the still generating idea portion to where it then seems you're not doing enough to tell me why the existing timelines we need to consider, because we're running out of time. We don't have enough time to consider new ideas. And in terms of specifications, this was supposed to say secondary, but don't mind that. Again, still relatively the same in terms of framing, but this is where you start adding in your refutation, adding in your weighing. You take some of the solvency part out because that would already been done by primary arguments in earlier parts of the round. And then you start weighing up some of these and then getting into the impacting. Again, these are the people that are providing you like reports on decisions you need to make. And so there's less of a point about impacting here, but more of a point about weighing, giving me why should I consider these options? What's heaviest to bear, if that makes sense. And finally, we get into the tertiary or tier 3. This is where we start getting into these ideas of now we're not just talking about stocks alone, like one singular stock. This is where we start getting into things like ETFs, options, shorting the market, derivatives, things that are wholly more complicated because they require multiple different moving parts, multiple different cogs and gears in the mechanisms of the debate in a company. And so then translating it to a debate point of view, this is where you start trying to churn the wheels of how the mechanisms of the debate function and how then your idea then greases the wheels and then forces us to now work on a decision-making process. Because tertiary arguments are the kind of arguments that can be the most unique from multiple different ways, but usually it's either because they provide the most unique level analysis or provide the essential analysis on how the timelines from both a primary and secondary arguments work within the round, within the journey of the round, and why they matter and why which ones matter then more than others. So now again, like I said before in the beginning of the lecture, hey, we have our timelines here. Now we need to see which ones do we need to consider and which ones do we need to abide by. If we go into this timeline, these are the consequences of this timeline. If we go into this timeline, this is the consequences of this timeline. This is why then, in terms of the specs of a tertiary argument, it's less on the framing, but it's not necessarily less in terms of quality, but less in terms of the word economy. Like we have to be very efficient. So we don't got time, we gotta get going. And then less on the refutation, because again, now we're more into, we don't have much time, let's lay everything out. Again, now we weigh more on the consequences and then tell the judge, these are the impacts of the consequences that we have to bear if we choose one timeline over the other. Any questions? Concerns, points of clarification? Nope. Awesome. Now, this is where then the tiers fit in terms of the timeline of arguments. Again, the sponsor is providing the premium, cream of the crop, tier 1 arguments. They set in the table. This is that Coca-Cola type stuff. Then, as we get into the constructive phase, we're still getting some of these tier 1 arguments, but now we're starting to introduce some divergence, some tier 2, some interesting perspectives, things that branch off. Now we get into the middle round, tier 2, and then we're starting to weigh some of our consequences. This is where we're getting it, and then we start getting into the tier 3. Late round, this is the end of tier 2, more tier 3, and then crystallization speeches are purely tier 3. Provide me the decision I need to make. Got to make a decision. If we don't make the decision now, everything blows up. If you're not telling me a decision I need to make, a voter issue, then we have some issues here. Now, in terms of examples of the tiers, I'm going to use something from NATS a few years ago. This is from NATS, I think 2019. And I think the reason why I'm using this piece of legislation to show an example of this is purely because I think the best way to explain the tiers is through foreign policy legislation, because it's a very easy way to explain the mechanisms of how certain arguments interact with each other. So, in terms of a primary argument, a primary start argument would just be like, first, if we're on the app, pass today's legislation to provide more oversight on Iran's authoritarian regime. The reason why this would be a primary argument is relatively because it's very easy, it's on the face. When you're looking at the piece of legislation, you're considering, okay, on its face, we have to examine the relationship between the United States and Iran. Boom. That is something that is immediately on face. That is something people are immediately going to want to talk about. So then if we go through the argument, we're like, provide more oversight over the Iran's authoritarian regime, because Iran's nuclear program is used to push their control over the regime. Currently, under the status quo, Iran's nuclear program, being out of the JCPOA, is flourishing, the Center for Strategic and American Studies. In October 2021 tells us that Iran's progress on enrichment has improved Tehran's ability to produce weapons-grade uranium and could soon make it difficult, if not impossible, to restore the one-year breakout timeline associated with the JCPOA. But by passing and rejoining the JCPOA, you now reduce the chance of it flourishing to continue when Iran is in the program, when Iran was in the program, because it worked. Foreign Policy Magazine, May of 2020, tells the IAEA also claimed that Iran had stopped its design work and was in compliance with its obligations under the nuclear pact until the United States reneged on the deal. This has never been more critical to why we need to bring Iran back into the fold, because the RAND Corporation tells us that Iran's possession of nuclear weapons will create greater instability in the Middle East. An inadvertent or accidental nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran is a dangerous possibility. So therefore, when passing provides the necessary oversight and slows down the production of uranium needed for Iran to have plenty of nuclear weapons, we can finally curb their attempt of power projection across the region. From Tehran to Tripoli, it's time to tone down the rhetoric and time to pass, because time is of the essence. This is, again, very general primary argument, because this is something that everybody would have considered, because this is especially something that the legislation is trying to do. It's trying to reduce Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon. That is critical, because we know what are the implications of that, which is Iran gets a nuclear weapon, causes further instability in the region. Yeah, any questions? Nope. All right, cool. Now, we've considered the surface level. We've considered the primary, we've considered the stock. Now, what I always explain to people that I've ever coached or I ever given advice from is then, let's go deeper. Let's analyze, okay, what if this happens both on the AF or the neg, who does then this possibly affect? If you look at a map, we always consider, okay, this country is Iran, it's in the Middle East. Who are the countries that are players in the region besides the region itself? We've always considered the United States points of view, but then who are other countries that are vying to have influence in the Middle East? And this is where we start getting into the secondary kind of arguments, where we start considering other players that are not immediately visible when we look at a map of the Middle East. So then we expand our scope and we're like, we know Iran has relationships with Russia. Now this is where we can talk about Russia a little bit. Some people will also consider possibly the idea of Russia as a primary argument, but I think it's more of a secondary argument. It's not something you will immediately consider in the face of instability in the Middle East. Why is my camera doing this? This is crazy. Hold on one moment. Okay, that's better. So then, secondary style argument will be like pass to curb Russian influence in the region, because curbing Iran's nuclear program reduces Russian leverage in the region with the United States. Senator Blank on the negation told you that JCPOA gives up too much concessions to the Iranians when the United States gets nothing. But that's false, because we get the Russians out of Iran's nuclear program. That's something the United States is always considering. How do we make sure big bad Russia does not get more power than it already has? We cut more of their connections with a major player in the region. If we expand our scope outside of the idea of the Middle East, then we say, now we must consider something like Russia. Russia's impact on the Middle East. If we cut that off, that cuts off an ability for our enemies or our adversaries to be more influential in places we want to be influential in. So then when CNN tells us that sources briefed on the matter state that the intelligence suggests that Iran has been asking Russia for help acquiring additional nuclear materials and with nuclear fuel fabrication. The only reason why that's been happening and why Senator Blank has been telling you that this gives up more concessions is because of the idea that Iran needs to get concessions from somewhere. So if they can't get it from us, they got to go to Russia. If we allow them to rejoin the JCPOA and get these concessions, they have no need to then go to Russia in the first place. It removes that incentive for them. And that has never been so important, because the Center for Strategic and International Studies in March of this year So that the main economic interest that Russia has focused on in the region has been Russian arms sales to the Middle East, the building of nuclear power plants, grain exports, and Russian tourists going to places like Turkey and Egypt. Russia is trying to expand their interests globally because they know they have no choice. If we want to be able to have better national security, security in the interest of the nation for the United States, keeping Russia at bay has never been more important to achieving that goal. And if it means providing some concessions to Iran so that Iran doesn't go to Russia, that's never been more important to then pass, because it's critical to pass to prevent Russian rubles to realize the goals of radicals. That's why you pass. You do see how now this requires some interaction and how this requires some engagement with the primary, but also has branched off into some idea that would not be initially something that they would consider, that your mom or general stock ideas would consider. If not, you can raise your hand or say something. Cool, cool, awesome. And now we get into tertiary. And a tertiary style argument is now we get deeper into that. Now, we've seen that how this implicates other countries. Now let's expand our scope even more. Okay, we see how Russia has to play in this. If Russia is trying to get a piece of the pie from how far they are, who does then this implicate all across the world? So then you start considering the idea of what is the broader implication of stopping Iran's nuclear program. Okay, who else is trying to get a nuclear program? It's not just Iran. It's other countries as well. We start considering, oh yeah, of course, North Korea. I would have never considered that because one, North Korea is nowhere near Iran. But two, it's not like something that you immediately consider because of the idea that we're trying to stop Iran's nuclear program. But if you widen your scope and go to a tertiary analysis of, okay, what is the central goal of this, which is just prevent more nuclear weapons from sprouting in the world, then you see, other countries are also trying to get nuclear weapons. This is not just an Iran exclusive thing. And so if it's a non-Iran exclusive thing, then this is where an argument of establishing international precedent for nuclear non-proliferation becomes more critical than ever, because it provides a necessary framework for delivering reduction of nuclear arms in the most volatile region in the world. So then this is where you start getting far more interaction, but then you also provide framing. So like everyone from Senator Blank talking about reduction in new Russian influence, Senator Blank talking about preventing vacuums of power, Senator Blank talking about reducing Chinese influence, Senator Blank talking about increasing the influence of Saudi Arabia. All of these things rest on the fundamental ideas that we just don't want things to get out of control, because instability mixed with nuclear weapons is not a cocktail I really want to enjoy. Therefore, and this is where then again, you're being efficient with your framing comes into realization. The side that makes sure that they push for more nuclear non-proliferation in the modern age is the side that should get your ballot. That is why you would side with the affirmation. And as we also probably see, as you get more into the tiers of arguments, especially when you need more interaction, you have less reliability on the idea of a card or evidence, because a lot of the ideas that were already presented in the round can be your basis for interaction and evidence, because you interact with those people who provided the evidence, and that will help you not have to be as card dependent. Remember, we don't want to be people that just rely so much on like evidence, because evidence does not make the argument. Your ability to be able to argue makes the argument. Your ability to provide logical reasoning to the argument to your ideas is the argument, because you can take out an argument in your refutation, but if you don't take out the warranting, that argument still stands intuitively or from a logical point of view. The argument is still valid. It's just that means that the evidence, you just need a new card, and we don't want to do that. We want to be able to show that the value of the argument is just not there, because if you do that, then there's no argument to begin with. So then this is where the card then comes in that the Federation of American Scientists on October of 2015 tells us that the deal promotes objectives central to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, as well as promises to stimulate democracy, potentially bringing stability to the region. And then this deal with Iran and the companion JCPOA could open up opportunities for nations like North Korea to stabilize their region in exchange for assistance in growing a peaceful nuclear program. Therefore, passing provides the necessary vision for a less nuclear future. For all those who wish to not have to live in fear of looking up at the sky again, whether it's a wannabe authoritarian in Brazil to a real authoritarian in North Korea. The only way you can stop them is to give them a seat at the table so you can at least know their concerns, hear their concerns of hearing the cries of their people. From Brasilia to Berlin to Bombay, past percent to prevent the worst bombs from detonating. So as you can see a lot more interaction is built in the top of the case here, because you now need to tell the judges, tell your round, why is this important that we make a decision on this particular timeline and we go in rather than not a timeline that just exists in the general status quo. Does that make sense? I hope everybody is at least getting something out of this. And so that's why, and that's where presentation ends. That is where we get into the idea of all of these timelines and all of these kinds of arguments. As you can see before, like we talked about, I'll actually go back to the slideshow. Tier 1, as you can see, is generally the most lean, I would say, but it's also the most dependent, because you could never give this kind of an argument later on around here. You can never give this kind of argument. You can never give a tier 1 in a timeline here or a timeline here, because we're in the early stages. All of that would have already been said by now, because that is something that we immediately set our eyes on. If you look at the map, we already see Iran. Everybody wants to stop Iran. So we're already considering ways to stop Iran. There's no way you could give that argument later in the round, because that's already been blown out of proportion, discussed, yada, yada, yada. And then, but it works in the reverse as well. There's no way you could give a tertiary argument early in the round, because none of this interaction happened in the first place. You have to wait. You have to wait and see what the timelines are looking like before we could then make a decision on a specific time. That is why positioning and anticipation of where certain arguments may fall then makes your job going into the round a lot easier. Because if you know your argument is relatively more nuanced and requires some interaction, you know you then need to wait a little bit in the round. But if you then know that if your argument is relatively more stock, you need to go early. If your argument is very unique, very niche, you need to wait to then get enough interaction to then be like, aha, now I have the path to be able to realize my argument in this round. So yeah, that is the general presentation in of itself. We can watch a video and see this in action from like a round, from an online round. But I think the biggest thing is if you have any questions or concerns, this is where we could talk right now. Any questions?
What's your favorite tier? What do you like the most?
What do I like the most? I don't really even have a favorite. It's just, for me, it's always the argument that gets me more intrigued about the round. I've loved early rounds in which set the tone early. It'd be like, hey, like this is it. And I've loved late round speeches that were just like, okay, that's something I didn't consider. That's something that I even didn't consider. And I like to think I'm a kind of person that does a lot of research. So 'cause
Gotcha.
I didn't even
Okay.
consider that then. Wow, that was intriguing. That's something I did. But again, it's all about execution, because I've seen people just not give me solvency in primary type arguments in the stock. And then I've seen people give me very niche, unique arguments, but then they don't tell me why it's important in the current phase of the debate. And I'm just like, why did you wait so long to just tell me that? Like, dude, okay, like, how does this weigh heavy in my mind? Oh, Ranger,
Alright,
talk to
cool.
me. Yeah, no problem, man.
In a mid-round speech, how do you know if you should use a tier 2 or tier 3 argument?
Well, it then considers like, does it immediately implicate the primary arguments, right? So if it's tier 2, it would immediately stem off of a primary argument, or like it will you extend your viewpoint of the world, but it doesn't rely on a broad generalization like from a primary argument, or it doesn't rely on something that you can immediately find out in like 2 seconds. Like I always say, like, if you can find out about, if you can generate an argument like that in about a minute or 2 minutes, it's probably primary. So that probably eliminates it. If it takes you forever, or it takes you a lot of link chains, then it's probably tertiary. If it takes you like a little bit more time, but it still implicates some of the arguments that were said earlier in the round, then it's probably secondary. If it implicates more ideas from secondary, like you need some people to talk about some other things in the round, then it's probably then tertiary, because you now not only have to wait for the primary arguments to get to go, but then you also have to wait for people to interact with the primary arguments and what their decisions on the primary arguments are before you then can then give your argument. And then that means it's probably tertiary. Or it requires some mechanism to then consider, weigh up all of the options that were already said, and then introduce your idea for why that's important, for why you're collapsing or coalescing all of these ideas in one basket, all of these ideas in another basket, and or all these timelines in, oh, these are bad timelines, these are good timelines. This is the way in which we weigh these timelines for why they're good and bad. Make sense?
Yep.
Awesome. Any other questions? Please, statements, questions, interact, talk to me.
How do you prepare and like adapt for like all 3 of these tiers? Like, if like the round doesn't go the way you plan and like you can't do primaries, they get stolen, rehash, all that stuff. You just like prep like all these contentions out.
No, you don't
Or-
necessarily prep the contentions out. It's more about prepping it's more about just understanding how the ideas interact. So
Right.
you don't need to, because if you prep like contentions, or you prep like if you prep all these contentions and warrants out like boom, 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 then that's very time consuming, and you want to be efficient with your time. Now, of course, you should be doing all of this like like once you get the bills, like you should do a lot more research and doing that. But then, even then, before the round, it's very time consuming. How you then realize some of these things that you're talking about is the idea of understanding how your primary argument interacts with whatever different impacts it could have. So, for instance, let's go domestic. If we talk about like healthcare, and we're talking about like Medicare for all, or like healthcare for all, or like introducing a public option,
Right. Okay.
the primary argument is like, okay, this gets people more insurance, right? And the impact of getting people more insurance is, hey, they can take care of like their sick loved ones. They can finally get treatment for like cancer or things of that nature. All of those potential impacting ideas can be also considered secondary arguments in of themselves, because those impacts then have impacts that you're not even considering. So if one impact of providing health insurance for all is being able to help people with pre-existing conditions, why is it important to help people with pre-existing conditions? Because helping people with pre-existing conditions means that you help people be able to early detect cancer, or being able to help people be able to detect early onset dementia, or help people be able to detect early onset depression. Why is it? And the impact of detecting all of those things is that you help prevent people like having to deal with deadly consequences, like possibly wanting to commit suicide, or helping people like reduce their cancer rates, which means that you reduce the overall cancer rates of the country. And so then those impacts have impacts that then stem off themselves as well. This is the idea of like terminalization. And then those ideas have arguments in of themselves. So you can consider then weighing up ideas and then framing like the side that gets people the most access to healthcare, or the side that doesn't let the economy collapse, or the side that prevents the whole healthcare system from collapsing, is the side that should win your debate. And that has implications on both the af and the neg. So
Gotcha.
that idea of, okay, how are people implicated in this situation, or how other ideas are implicated in certain situations, and then what are the implications of those implications, then leads to you getting into the secondary and tertiary style arguments that I talked about. And then
That makes
being
sense.
able to anticipate all of those then gives you better idea of where you yourself should position yourself giving a speech in whatever the journey of the round is.
All right, cool.
Awesome. Any other questions, concerns, or just general statements? Anything that people are confused about? Ranger, go ahead.
So, like, how would you prep all of these arguments for a round? Like tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3?
Okay. Give me a random topic that you're always confused about.
Sports, because there was this like one bill about like banning contact sports, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. So let's consider this the very stock idea. Why would you want to ban contact sports?
Because there are more injuries because of the contact, and also like it can lead to other health problems. Like if you get hit in the head enough, like for example, football, you might get dementia, or you might get brain damage.
Right.
Concussion.
Right. So the main concern is generally just injuries, right?
Would you also consider maybe increasing accessibility to like not academics, but let's say intellectual sports, part of like that?
Is that a question for me or for Ranger?
Kind of both.
Sure. I can see that, like the idea of but you see, and you see, I'm glad you said that, because I was actually gonna give a response to Ranger, which is like, okay, why are injuries like so bad? Because especially cognitive injuries, the impact of like getting brain trauma to the head is important, because then it reduces the ability for people to have a life post sports. And why is that problematic? Because then you can get a secondary argument of like, this caps someone's ability to be able to have intellectual capacities, or have an ability to be able to talk, not have an ability to talk, but an ability to have an intellectual life, or a life post sports that involves them doing business, or pursuing other educational opportunities, which would link into the idea of what Karina is talking about, which is advocating for more non-sports related activities, like whatever club at school, for instance. So you see how, Ranger, your idea of, hey, we want to prevent injuries, we want to prevent brain trauma, we want to prevent things that are catastrophic to the life of the individual. Why is that important? Because the impact that goes to someone's head can impact their academic life, or can impact their other non-sports related pursuits. And while someone may play sports for 10, 20 years of their life, they still have potentially 50, 60, 70 years of a life in the future. Does that make sense for both Ranger and Karina?
Yeah.
Karina, how about you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. Katie, go ahead.
Do you happen to have any tips on like once you think of like the tier 1 arguments, like how to think beyond that so you can like find tier 2 and tier 3 arguments?
Right. And I think we talked. I talked about a little bit of that in the lecture. I say the biggest thing is that once you figure out the contention of a primary argument, something that's immediately on the face, you then consider what is the impact. How does that impact people? And there's usually, very rarely have I ever come across an idea in which I come across a stock issue that doesn't have multiple impacts to it. Once you figure out the multiple impacts, even just 2 or 3, you then figure out the impact of that impact. Once you start considering those ideas, those impacts in of itself that you just considered can be points in of themselves. That's usually the easiest way you can generate second and tertiary ideas. Another tip would just be always consider what is the broader implications of your point. Again, that's why I did this on foreign policy, because we always think about foreign policy on face. We always think about the initial relationship that the bill is trying to deal with, like US, like trying to institute the Iran nuclear deal. We always then think about, okay, what is this? How does this implicate, or how does this impact the United States and Iran? Taking yourself out of the idea of just strictly this linear relationship of US and Iran, and saying, okay, who are the major players in the Middle East that are not countries in the Middle East? Once you ask yourself that question, then you start generating secondary arguments. Okay, take it from a domestic point of view. If we go on Medicare, who we think about, okay, we're always trying to make sure people with pre-existing conditions get healthcare. Who are the people what are the kinds of pre-existing conditions people majority have? Once you figure out that, then figure out impacts that help those people when they get health insurance. Make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Lucas, talk to me.
Can you send me the slide deck later, because I missed the first part of it?
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. I'll put it in the Discord, and I'll also just link it to everybody here. Restricted anyone link. While I'm doing that, do you have any questions beyond this, or?
No.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right, Charon, talk to me.
Hi, so I had a quick, when we're talking about like flipping sides, like let's say like if it's like a really app heavy or neg heavy, does that come with like being able to anticipate like the primary? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, very good question. And I deal with this a lot because I have a couple of people I coach that are always mad when they have to flip because their recency is like bad. Like they'll get dead last recency and they're just like, oh, what do I do here? And I'm just like, calm down. Like, it's okay. And they're always like, Jomi, how are you so calm in this situation? I'm like, because all you have to do is then just consider the ideas in the round, and then how do they interact with each other? And then also, what is the fundamental warranting to most of these ideas? So what do we mean by that? Is that if you have to flip because the side is very heavy on one side, how you do that is, this is why anticipation is so critical before the tournament. If you consider the arguments on one side, you always have to consider how it interacts with the ideas on the opposite side. That's why coming into the tournament, I wouldn't even say prepped, because you don't need to necessarily come in with full-fledged speeches to be able to then flip and still be able to give good speeches. It's all about understanding the interactions, understanding the impacts. If you then understand how it impacts on one side, then the opposite side is trying to tell you, like say if we're on the AF and we're always considering the impacts on the AF, your job on the neg is to consider how the implications of the harms. So then you start considering the stock issues, the primary issues on the neg, and its impacts. Once you understand those impacts, again, same line of logic that I told Katie, consider the impacts of those impacts, or broaden your horizons and consider what other sectors of the economy, what other sectors of human welfare, what other sectors of the globe, what other sectors of the international community am I not initially considering that may have some form of vested interest in this topic that we're talking about today. Well, I think the biggest thing, like in congressional debates, that everybody always has relatively limited perspectives because they don't want to veer off topicality. But you'll be surprised at how limiting you are on yourself if you just open up the box just a little bit, and you'll be surprised how it's not as non-topical as you're thinking. Does that answer your question, Charan?
Yeah, so basically, like from what I'm understanding, like you kind of before the round kind of just like anticipate the main arguments for each side and then like kind of branch out a little bit and like look at the impacts of those and how they interact with each other, and that will help you be able to flip if you need to. Okay, thank you.
Because when you understand the mechanisms, or you're at least once you look at the mechanisms, then it becomes a lot easier for you to understand, okay, what is the thing that's blocking the mechanism for the affirmation? What is the thing that's blocking the mechanism for the negation? Why is the negation not generating as much offense on the affirmation? How do I help it generate more offense?
Got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Lucas, go ahead. Talk to me.
I don't think I'm in the Discord server where you like sent the thing.
It should be in the chat now.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question here from AG. He asks me, how do you prep on your pad without it getting too messy as you go later in round? Biggest thing, don't write too much. I know that sounds easier said. Sounds more easier said than done. But I will say the biggest thing is, if you're a one pad kind of guy, I would say biggest thing is like flow on your computer, or like take a separate piece of paper and flow on your paper. That way it saves you more space on your speech pad. And then as you are writing the points, I say biggest thing is write your claim, whatever, or write the way you're gonna frame. And then you have each person like, and collapse all of these people who are generally arguing the same thing, or generally arguing a similar proposition, or generally arguing under the same kind of warranting. Collapse those people under that idea, and then once you do that, then you're all good to go, and then you go off your own analysis and whatever evidence you want to talk about. Does that satisfy you? Oh, sticky notes as well, that too. There's also like a quick trick that I know a lot of people do. Let me see if I have a pad. Hold on, give me one moment. Yeah, so I know a lot of people do this trick where they'll have a pad here, and if they want to keep this page a lot more neat, they literally would fold the page they want to keep neat in half, and then they'll write on this side here. That way, then when they need to flip to it, they can just turn it over, and they keep this side a lot more neat because they also wrote some stuff over here or over here. Make sense? Hopefully it does. Katie, go ahead, talk to me.
I have a question, like going back to like my previous question, like I'm having trouble coming up with like broader implications of like some bills I've been researching recently. Like I'm going to middle school Nats, and there's this bill.
Congratulations.
There's this bill that's like Congress considering sanctions against any nations that are promoting like internet freedom for citizens. So like the first thing that comes up to my mind is like sanctions on China, because
Mhm.
China has like the Great Firewall.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not sure how I would like extend like the like human rights type thing on the affirmation to like a global, like more broader implication.
Well, I think that's a great question to ask, because I think it fits very well into the things that I talked about in terms of Iran. Think about it. Broaden your approach, broaden your horizons. What other countries are relatively more authoritarian countries besides China? Or at least restrict democracy in some form or fashion.
North Korea, maybe.
Okay. What else?
Russia.
Okay.
Like
There's more.
I don't know, like
Give me one more. You talked about one in Asia, you talked about one in the Middle East. What about South America? Are there authoritarian or dictatorships in South America?
Venezuela.
There you go. Yeah, great. Do they restrict internet access in those countries?
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, so are you like kind of setting an international like precedent?
Yep, that was the tertiary style argument here. If I share the screen here again, I'm already sharing it. Yeah, that's literally this tertiary argument that I have right here. Establish international precedent for nuclear non-proliferation. You can establish the same kind of framing for this internet access thing.
Yeah, because the resolution is like sanctions against like any nation, not like China specifically.
Exactly. So of course, the immediate country you think of is China because of the Great Firewall. That will be probably the primary argument. But in the secondary argument is countries that we don't immediately consider. And then the tertiary argument is that what is the broader implications of attacking or impacting all of these countries? And how does that show face on us?
Okay, so like US values basically.
Yeah, US values. And then how does that impact us in terms of a political, social, or economic spectrum?
Yeah, okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Are you starting to get it now?
Yeah, so like kind of extending it to like a global type of perspective instead of just like zooming in on like one actor.
Extend your lens outward, broaden your horizons.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Catherine, talk to me.
So I think my pad is like kind of messy because I think I write my speech out like way too much. So do you think I should like paraphrase a bit more? Because I'm trying to shorten my speech into like 1.5 pages.
Okay. I think the biggest thing is that we'll do whatever works for you. And what do I mean by that? Of course, what I mean is that when I was competing in STEM, I created a language for myself that when I read my pad to memorize, I only knew what I was talking about. Like if someone read my pad, they would just be like, Jomi, what is this? This looks like Swahili. Like, I'm like, it might be, I don't know. And it's because I created coded language that would make my pad a lot more streamlined and a lot less messy. So it's easier for me to read. But then also the acronyms that I was reading off of, I knew exactly what they meant. So if you think about it from a perspective of source, yeah, we'll finish up in 5 minutes, Nick. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. If you think about it from a perspective of like, let's do acronyms. Like NYT for me meant New York Times. TE meant The Economist. CSIS means the Center for Strategic International Studies. CNN meant obviously CNN. WP meant Washington Post, or I'll do WAPO, which meant Washington Post. RF meant refutation, and then I'll put center blank. We'll do this, and then I'll have certain words shortened. That way, I didn't have to write the whole word, but then I knew what the word meant. Overall, that would make the pad a lot neater because then there's a lot shorter stuff on the pad. But again, only I knew what certain acronyms, abbreviations, and other forms of shortening words meant for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, also, so should you paraphrase your evidence on your pad and like say that, or should you like write the whole thing out?
It's up to you. It depends on if you have space on the pad. I would say, of course, paraphrase but paraphrase in the sense of create a way to abbreviate words for yourself. That way you know what it means on the pad, and then so you are able to then say the whole thing on when you're giving the speech out loud. But it also, yeah. Also, like what we said, like what other people said in the chat, like sticky notes is a lot easier. Can work for you as well. But I know sticky notes can be a little weird for people at times.
Okay,
And there's a
thank
bunch
you.
of different ways. There's like there's resources that I'll put in the Discord for where it shows. It's like a padding lecture from a camp I used to be at, where it showed different ways people padded and it gave you different examples. And these are people that all padded only one page. So I'll put that in the Discord,
Okay, thank you.
of course. All right, I think that's it. Again, thank you so much for everybody that gave me their time. Your time is valuable to me. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. In the chat, put my email if you have any questions, concerns, if you need any more dialogue on some of these things that we talked about, please don't be afraid to email me, contact me. I'm more than welcome to sit down and chat with you about more of this stuff in terms of like this argumentation jargon and like putting yourself in the right positions. It's been a pleasure talking and lecturing to you guys today. I hope to see a lot of you guys at Nats, and take care. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Stop the recording.